Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
The Swiftsure slowly and carefully approached the stern of Kiev. This was a very dangerous position to get into. They could see the carrier's massive propellers churning in the water, and she was only about 10 or 12 feet away.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to Cold War history. Please make sure you follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss future episodes. During the Cold War, some of the most dangerous encounters between East and West took place far beneath the ocean's surface. I speak with historian Dr. Paul Brown, author of Secret Warriors, British Submarines During the Cold War. He reveals the extraordinary covert missions carried out by Royal Navy submarines as they monitored Soviet naval bases in the Barents Sea. British boats gathered vital intelligence by recording the acoustic signatures of Soviet submarines, trailing enemy vessels and observing major naval exercises. These missions were risky and occasionally resulted in collisions, such as the dramatic incident involving HMS Warspite in 1968. This is a rare glimpse into one of the Cold War's most secretive battlefields. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Paul Brown to our Cold War conversation. Anything about Cold War submarines is always going to pique my interest, and this book certainly taught me quite a bit that I wasn't aware of. I'm quite surprised you managed to prize some of this information out of submariners, or have you got some other sources?
I did interview about 10 COs and a couple of other people who'd been on this, one an engineer and one an ERA, an artificer. So I got a lot of stories from them, and a few of those were redacted a little bit by the MOD, but in the 90% of the stuff, or 95% of the stuff they gave me, I was eventually able to get through after quite a tortuous process of clearance with the MOD. I also put in a number of freedom of information requests to the MOD, and where there's any sniff of Soviet interaction, they don't want to know and they won't release anything. But I did manage to get some other stuff that was not quite so sensitive, that was not previously in the public domain, so that was good.
And what do you mean by Soviet interaction?
It was commonplace for these submarines to go up to what they euphemistically called northern waters, which meant right outside the Russian bases in the Barents Sea. And in the course of that, they got into very close contact with the Russian submarines and also surface warships. And there were a number of incidents where there were minor collisions or significant collisions, or instances where the British submarine was forced to surface and so on. Or just the simple business of trailing a Soviet submarine, which they did a lot of. The MOD doesn't really want to accept that existed. So they're very cagey about anything which involves a submarine making contact with, albeit acoustic contact or whatever, with a Russian submarine or a Russian warship. So all of that stuff remains heavily classified, although quite a bit of it has leaked out into the public domain through various books written by Cold War submariners or occasional disclosures in the papers. So I did tap into those as well, but there is a lot of stuff in the book that's there for the first time. It doesn't appear anywhere else.
And that was what intrigued me, and that is what we will be coming on to in a little while. I wanted to start off with you explaining what was the status of the British submarine force in the early part of the Cold War.
When the Second World War ended, the Royal Navy had about 120 submarines, which is twice as many as they thought they could handle in peacetime, in inverted commas. And so they immediately set about scrapping all the slightly older and smaller boats, because the smaller boats weren't really suitable for what was becoming the Cold War operation. So they reduced the size of the submarine fleet to about 60 or 65. Now, the big difference was that the Second World War submarines, their main purpose was to sink merchant shipping or to sink surface warships. They weren't primarily at all anti-submarine submarines. So the new Cold War dimension was that the Soviets were building up a huge submarine fleet in the late 40s. They even had a plan to increase the size of their fleet to 1,000 submarines. Now, that never actually happened, although at one point they did get up probably to about 450, which was an enormous number. And because they were building so many, they were pretty modern submarines. And they had access to German U-boat technology and so on, as did America and Britain to some extent. So the role of British submarines was redefined in 1948 to be the sinking of Soviet submarines. The threat of Soviet submarines was such that it was imagined that they would come out from their bases, and their biggest bases were in the Barents Sea near Murmansk, and they would come out into the Atlantic to sink the merchant shipping which was supplying Europe from primarily America. And the role of British submarines in that context was to station themselves outside the bases and cut off the submarine offensive at source so that they could be torpedoed or mined when they left their bases near Murmansk. So suddenly you needed a different type of submarine, and also the technology had moved on. British submarine technology in the Second World War hardly changed. The submarines that were being built in 1945 were very little different to those being built in 1939, whereas the Germans had made leaps and bounds, particularly between 1943 and 1945, after they could see they were losing or had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. They were introducing new technologies to produce much faster submarines. So that fleet of 60 or 65 submarines was effectively obsolescent. It was no match for the faster submarines that could be built using the kind of designs that the Germans were using in the last days of their U-boats. So the British and the American, for that matter, submarine fleets had to be updated by modernizing war-built boats and, of course, starting the construction of new, faster boats as well that would be able to evade anti-submarine forces. Because the war-built submarines typically had an underwater speed of about 9 knots. That made them very vulnerable once they were detected, to anti-submarine surface forces like the convoy escorts. Whereas faster submarines under German designs could make 15 knots submerged, or even, in the case of their high-test peroxide boats that they were prototyping, as much as 25 knots submerged. So they were radically different. They were in a different league to the British and American war-built boats, and something had to be done about that because the submarine menace from Russia was seen as one of the principal threats certainly in the early days of the Cold War.
And during the 1950s, the British are doing some tests with that peroxide propulsion system, and they have quite a few accidents in the 1950s with their submarine fleet.
Yeah, it was. The early 50s, sort of 1950 to 55, was not a good time. First of all, high-test peroxide that was used through a catalyst to produce oxygen, which would enable oil fuel to be burnt while our submarine was submerged and drive a turbine, which would in turn give much faster speeds. But the high-test peroxide was highly volatile. And it only had to come into contact with a dab of oil, for example, and it would spontaneously ignite. So we acquired one of these submarines, which was named HMS Meteorite. We renamed it. And we built two more, Explorer and Excalibur, basically as trial submarines to test out this technology. So crews on them got used to minor explosions occurring, and some occasions where they had to actually surface and everybody had to leave the boat and get on the casing while the problem was sorted out. So it was inherently a rather dangerous technology. And it also led to the loss of one submarine, not propelled by this system, but they were also trialing torpedoes using high test peroxide. And HMS Sidon, which was at Portland, suffered an explosion in one of the torpedoes as it was being loaded, which was to go out on trials to test the torpedoes. And the submarine sank alongside the depot ship with loss of about 13 lives. So by this time, the Americans anyway had given up on HTP because they saw the future very much as nuclear submarines. So by about 1950, the Admiralty for the Royal Navy was more or less reaching the same decision in the early 50s. And so their interest in HTP waned, but it was a little while before they could manage to coerce the Treasury to produce any money to build a nuclear submarine, which of course was achieved in 1956, which was to be HMS Dreadnought, eventually launched in 1960 and coming into service in 1963, the first British nuclear submarine. So that was the future. HTP was a cul-de-sac, a dead end, really. But the British had persevered with it a bit longer than anybody else.
Yeah, because I think some people forget there was still rationing in the UK into the 1950s. The UK government, sounds similar to nowadays, didn't have a lot of money to spend on defence. Now, during this period, even with the submarines that they've got, HMS Totem has a patrol up in the Barents Sea, which is one of the first Barents Sea patrols.
Totem was one of 8 Super Ts. They were war-built submarines, but they'd had the most extensive of the various conversions that were done to increase their underwater speed to about 15 knots by streamlining the hull and also doubling the size of their battery pack. So they could be quite a lot faster. And those 8 boats were the boats that really pioneered in the 50s and early 60s even the Barents Sea patrols. Now these were covert patrols, and HMS Totem was the first in 1955. There had been 1 or 2 forays up that way with British submarines to test out 1 or 2 things, but they now became a regular part of submarine operations, and indeed remained so for 35 years, at least till the end of the Cold War. And so Totem was fitted out with various intelligence gathering equipment, both electronic and acoustic. And she went up to the Barents Sea and stationed herself somewhere in the Kola Inlet off of Murmansk and was monitoring just whatever she could find, basically, in terms of mostly Russian warship, submarine and surface warship activity, but also monitoring things like the testing of missiles from land sites and also Soviet exercises, because the Soviet Northern Fleet had its main exercise area in the Barents Sea. And so when they were exercising, our submarines were around trying to pick up as much data as they could about what was going on. That was very much a pioneering patrol. And of course, those boats were still quite limited. They had to go back out to sea every night and surface to recharge their batteries. They had to use their snorts to produce air for their diesel engines. It was quite a difficult operation, and they weren't that fast compared to surface escorts and so on that were around them. But they did a good job in at least establishing those patrols for quite a few years.
And were these sort of like the first attempts to get acoustic signatures of Soviet boats?
Yes, they were. That was important because it would enable the class of a Soviet submarine to be identified. And sometimes even individual boats would have a unique sound signature. This became important because, of course, sonar in various ways was all the time trying to monitor Soviet submarine activity. One of the systems was the American system of SOSUS, which was a series of hydrophones on the seabed. And it was all very well picking up a sound from something, but it was helpful to know what it was. So part of their role was to accumulate a library of these sound signatures, which could be used in the future to identify the class of submarine and even, as I say, occasionally the individual submarine, because they might have a unique sound from their propeller or something like that, which was a little bit different to the others in their class. There were occasions where those submarines like Totem were detected, and a Russian surface warship, and you'll see in some of the accounts they were depth charged, which sounds pretty scary. In practice, they were almost certainly practice depth charges with a much smaller explosive charge, there to basically warn off the submarine.
So Britain is now deciding that the peroxide route is not the correct route for propulsion, and they're looking at nuclear technology. The US is ahead of the game there, and the legendary Admiral Rickover is in charge of their program, but he's not keen to hand the Brits the technology.
No, we had to stick with the conventional submarines, and it took some time before the technology became available. For example, Dreadnought's nuclear reactor was an American nuclear reactor. All our subsequent nuclear submarines had British nuclear reactors, but the Dreadnoughts was produced by the Westinghouse Corporation. Similarly, with Polaris missiles, it took some time before we had access to that technology. But clearly, NATO had been extant for 10 years or more, and there was an incentive, at least to politicians, if not Admiral Rickover, for us to embrace the technology and update our submarine fleet. So that did happen.
You were talking earlier about HMS Totem and the practice depth charges that were dropped on them, but one of the incidents I found fascinating, amongst many fascinating incidents in this book, was the 1965 one with HMS Opportune.
Yeah, she was on patrol in the Norwegian Sea, and she got an intelligence report that there were some destroyers exercising in a particular area, and she moved closely to those two Scory class destroyers, and she was able to photograph them and get their sonar signatures and so on. But she was detected, which was comparatively rare because the Oberon class were very quiet submarines, and usually in these sort of incidents were not detected. But here she was, and they began to drop explosive depth charges, practice depth charges, and they pursued Opportune for 30 hours. She'd gone deep and she was moving away at slow speed, but they managed to pursue her until it reached a time when her battery was exhausted. She was a diesel-electric submarine, and she had to surface with the two destroyers in close proximity. And one of the destroyers then thanked Opportune for working with them. Surely they didn't believe it might be one of their own submarines. The other destroyer moved in and read Opportune's pennant number and exchanged identities. And recognizing their error, they escorted Opportune out of the area for 48 hours before departing. So it was an interesting incident with the sort of contact which comparatively rarely occurred, but Opportune was actually thanked for working with these destroyers. Not very often the covert patrol submarines were thanked for what they did.
Yeah, that is a brilliant story. Almost the camaraderie of the sea, I guess, going on there to some degree. Now, all of these operations were part of something called the Holy Stone intelligence program, which I think was the US name for this intelligence gathering.
Yeah, it was a joint operation between the Brits and the Americans. So at any one time, we had 2 submarines which were kitted out for these special, what they called sneakies, these covert operations. They had all the special intelligence gathering equipment and so on. But we only had 2 of them. So one might be on patrol, and one might be back at base with people on leave or maintenance or whatever. And they might relieve one another. But by working with the Americans, we could ensure that at any one time there was always at least one submarine stationed in the Barents Sea, close to Murmansk, gathering information. Now, the primary role of that submarine was to detect any surge of Soviet warships, which might be making for the Atlantic. Coming out of their bases, there were several bases around Murmansk. Coming out of their bases, a surge of submarines and possibly surface warships might be the first sign of some imminent hostilities. So that was the primary role. Now, because obviously that didn't really happen, there were a few surges. For example, on one occasion, 5 submarines came out together, which caused great excitement. But their secondary role was to gather all this other intelligence information on both the technological aspects of the Russian ships, but also their tactics, for example, during their exercises.
Do you get any indication from the interviews that you've done how close in they got to the Soviets? Because the Soviets have got this 12-mile territorial zone. I get the impression that the Americans thought that the British crews were much more forward, let's say, in some of their deployments. But do you get much indication?
One of the differences between the Brits and the Americans, that because we only had 2 submarines at any one time doing this work, the commanding officers and the executive officer, those sort of people, were quite experienced in it and perhaps quite willing to take calculated risks. Whereas for the American submarines, there are a lot more submarines, and it was more like, this is another patrol. They weren't necessarily so expert in it. As in terms of how close they got, that difficult to pin down. We only recognise the 3-mile limit, and of course the Russians claim a 12-mile limit. The nearest I was allowed to say in the book was our submarines got as close as they could. We know, let's just say anecdotally, there were submarines that got right inside the Kola inlet, right up to the submarine bases. Now, is that anecdote true? We don't know, because certainly the MOD is not going to confirm it. You can draw your own conclusions about whether we actually stuck to the 3-mile limit or even perhaps the 12-mile limit, because there are lots of opportunities if you've got closer in. For example, you've got a prototype Russian submarine, which is of great interest for intelligence purposes. Now, it would come out of Murmansk, and it would be on the surface at first, before it got into deep enough water to do a test dive. That would provide a great opportunity for one of our submarines to do an underwater look and actually go right underneath the Soviet submarine, which is on the surface, photographing its rudder, its hull shape, its propellers, and so on. And so there was an incentive to get in close.
And that underwater look technique was pretty unique to the British, wasn't it?
I'm not sure. It probably was. The incidents I know of what involved the Brits, yes. One of the most famous incidents was in 1977, when HMS Swiftsure actually did an underwater look on the Russian aircraft carrier Kiev. in the Barents Sea. And the Kiev, again, was of considerable intelligence interest because she was only 16 months old and very little intelligence had actually been gathered on her at that time. Swiftsure actually achieved quite a stunning intelligence coup during that underwater look, because the Kiev was not on her own. She was escorted by 3 guided missile cruisers and 2 destroyers who were exercising in that Northern Fleet exercise area that I talked about before. And the Swiftsure slowly and carefully approached the stern of Kiev, where she could take advantage of the blind spot in Kiev's sonar and the wake of the Kiev. Now, this was a very dangerous position to get into, of course, and it required intense concentration from the captain, the helmsman, the plainsman, the control panel operator, and every other man in what was the fore end, the control room of Swiftsure. And it took several exhausting hours, which had to be carried out without mistake to avoid any embarrassing detection. And after carefully adjusting her position below the carrier, Swiftsure slowly began the ascent with her periscope raised. And finally, they could see the carrier's massive propellers churning in the water, and she was only about 10 or 12 feet away from Kiev's hull. All that was very tricky, because if the submarine had lost trim and just risen a few feet, that could have caused a collision between a 4,000-ton submarine and a 40,000-ton aircraft carrier. But the last thing Swiftsure wanted to do was to have to break surface, A, because she'd be detected, and then she'd be moved in on by patrolling anti-submarine helicopters or aircraft. But she managed to remain undetected and gather all that data. Then she began slowly go deep and withdraw. And she returned to her base on what was the 70th day of her deployment. So that was quite a significant, but there were lots of other underwater looks, but that's just an example of the kind of thing that was achieved. In that instance, the Kiev was underway. Others were sometimes undertaken at anchorages where it was easier and not quite so dangerous to try and get underneath a Soviet warship.
There's many tales of daring do in this book, as well as that one. And these submarines are operating close proximity to these Soviet ships, as you've described, and there were collisions. And I think probably one of the most serious ones was Warspite.
Yeah, Warspite, that was 1968. And she was trailing a Soviet Echo 2 class SSGN. Now, SSGN meant the submarine was carrying cruise missiles, not ballistic missiles, and that the role of the SSGNs was to attack American aircraft carrier strike groups if they approached in the Norwegian Sea or the Barents Sea. So again, they were intelligence targets. And the Warspite had been trailing this Echo 2 for some time. That was all very well, because the trailing submarine obviously had to keep its distance. And what happened in this instance, and caused one or two other similar instances, was that the Echo 2, for some reason, slowed down. Now, it was very difficult for the trailing submarine to detect a change in the range of a Soviet boat that it was trailing, because the only way it could actually measure the range was by deviating from its course and getting a bearing from a different angle. And then with two intercepting fixes, they could determine the range. But they didn't want to change their course because that would make them much more detectable. Unknowingly, Warspite had actually come up right under the stern of the Soviet submarine and hit the ballast tank of the other boat. And the crew described there was an awful bang and crushing and scraping we're pushed right over in our chairs. There are alarms on all of the panels, bells ringing, red lights flashing. The boat had violently heeled 74 degrees to starboard. Swinging back from that impact, she passed under her quarry and hit the Soviet boat again, this time rolling 65 or 70 degrees to starboard and leaving many of the crew disorientated. Men and equipment were thrown about the boat, causing several injuries and a struggle for survival on board the boat. And the heavy list threatened to trigger the automatic safety procedures that would shut down Warspite's reactor. And the first lieutenant had to react very quickly to execute the emergency procedure that would stop that happening. And he managed to achieve that. And the boat had to surface, and because there had to be some assessment, for all they knew, the pressure hull could have been damaged. Ultimately, even sinking the Warspite, they had to surface to assess the damage. They found that the other boat, the Soviet boat, also had surfaced, and they were preparing to offer the Soviet boat medical assistance, but they intercepted a radio signal from the Soviet boat to say that there were no casualties, and eventually the Soviet boat was able to make it back to its base, but heavily damaged. And similarly, the Warspite was very heavily damaged. The whole of her conning tower, or her sail, as it was called, was wrecked, and she had to withdraw and gingerly get back to the UK for repairs. Now, to this day, the MOD won't admit that this incident occurs, and that they say that Warspite had hit an iceberg. Attempts were made to cover the damage as the boat returned to its base at Faslane with tarpaulins, and she had to proceed to Barrow, where the whole of the fin or the sail was replaced with one that was actually intended for another submarine that was under construction there at the time, which I suppose was quite lucky. So, yeah, that was certainly one of the biggest. The other major collision occurred in 1981 when HMS Scepter was trailing a strategic submarine, a Delta-class ballistic missile submarine, again up in the Barents Sea. And there are different accounts of what might have happened here. The one I find most plausible was very similar, in fact, to the Warspite incident, that the Delta had slowed down, and the change of range was not detected by Scepter. A collision again occurred, and there was major damage to the casing and the conning tower of Scepter. But again, luckily, the hull wasn't pierced, but both boats were heavily damaged. And the Scepter managed to make it back to base, where both the commanding officer and the executive officer, it was actually the executive officer who had charge of the boat when the incident occurred, they were both taken off the boat in a rather summary fashion, and a new CO was appointed. So it was certainly a black mark on a submarine officer's record when an incident like this had happened. In some cases, it was career-ending. In other cases, the officers concerned went on to have stellar careers. So there's not always a lot of logic in what was happening. In the case of Scepter, it was reported that the crew believed their CO was going to stay in place, but that the Americans, hearing about the incident, insisted that a more severe punishment should take place. So whereas with Warspite, the CO continued in his command, perhaps because the Americans weren't involved, I don't know. And so that chap basically, I won't give his name, but he was given a desk job, and that was it as far as his career was concerned. Whereas his executive officer went on to command both an attack nuclear submarine and a ballistic missile nuclear submarine, and be promoted after that. So there isn't always a lot of logic. And I put in freedom of information requests to obtain the Board of Inquiry reports, perhaps optimistically, and I got nothing because they will not admit this occurred. And in the case of Scepter, again, when word of something had happened got out, the MOD insisted she'd hit an iceberg. Sailors at the base at Faslane said it's rather funny Scepter hit a phosphor bronze iceberg, because what had happened was the phosphor bronze propeller of the Delta had chewed into the casing of Scepter, and some of them, the crew on board, maintained that to this day they have still got a piece of that phosphor bronze from that incident.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Because I think with Warspite, that was so terrifying for some of the crew that they left the Navy as a result, or went to other service.
Yeah, some left the Navy, a few left the Navy, others asked to be transferred out of the submarine service. It was obviously a pretty traumatic experience, because for all they knew, that the boat could have been terminally damaged. And the whole incident was just completely outside their comfort zone. So the COs who took over Scepter, because there was a change of CO, had a job, he says, I recount this in the book, to rebuild the confidence of what the majority of the crew stayed on board the boat. And he had to go through a confidence building process with them, he says, so that they could get back to their previous levels of efficiency and confidence.
Yeah, you talk in the book of him taking the Warspite on something called angles and dangles, which is
that's right.
really manoeuvring it and throwing it about a bit.
That's right. They could do that. And they obviously enjoyed doing that on nuclear submarines, because they were actually faster submerged than they were on the surface. So they could make 25 to 30 knots submerged and were highly maneuverable. So that was one tactic used sometimes by a new CO to show a crew what he could do and to instill some confidence in him. And that particular CO says that's what he did there, yeah.
Yeah, and talking of angles and dangles and submarine terminology, I'm delighted to see mention of Crazy Ivans in the book, because obviously my main reference to submarines is Hunt for Red October.
Yes. Yeah, and a lot of Crazy Ivans was a tactic which our submarines occasionally encountered when they were trailing a Soviet submarine. For some reason, and this was rare, but the CO of the Soviet boat might completely reverse course, turn through 180 degrees, and in their terminology, the Brits' terminology, charge down on them as this Crazy Ivan. Now, why would they do that if they did that? Two reasons. Either, A, they had detected they were being trailed, and they wanted to let the other boat know they were being trailed and give them a scare. But of course, it was a dangerous maneuver, because neither boat knew the depth at which the other boat was operating. They might be able to guess it, but they didn't know it. So that's one possible reason. The other reason might be because they had blind spots in their stern arcs. They wanted to find out if there was anything following them. Then the best way might be to reverse course and see what their sonar picked up. There's no doubt it probably occurred. And it was quite scary, because the submariners in, say, the British boat could be totally aware that this was happening, because the Soviet boat would pass so close. They could feel the churning of its screws and the turbulence caused by the other boat. So it was a very real experience.
Yeah, nerves of steel. But by the late 70s, there's an introduction of a new feature called towed array sonar, which helps with detection, because it's towed behind the submarine. It's away from the machinery and other noise that might give erroneous sounds to the sonar.
That's right. Towed array sonars seem to have been around in a very primitive form for a while, but unsurprisingly, it was the Americans who perfected it, probably, I think, in the early 70s. But we didn't get it till the late 70s on British submarines. As you say, it could be more effective than sonars on the boat, because it was not affected directly by the noise of the submarine's own machinery. And the towed array sonar, these could be massive arrays of hydrophones, perhaps a 500-meter long length of cable with hydrophones on it, on a much longer cable, which could be perhaps up to 2 kilometers long. And it was incredibly effective at detecting sounds from a very long range. Now, as an example of that, if we can switch to something very different, the Falklands War, when HMS Conqueror detected with the General Belgrano, the Argentine cruiser, and her task group, she was 90 miles away, 90 nautical miles away. So that was the sort of range, or greater on some occasions, that towed array sonar could make detection. So Conqueror had that towed array sonar and was able to pick up Belgrano, was able to then close on her and trail her for 29 hours, actually, before the final permission was given from Whitehall for Conqueror to actually attack and torpedo Belgrano. So that was one quite dramatic example, if you like, of a towed array. A towed array was used by surface warships as well. But we had the technology, the Americans had the technology, and we got quite a lot of the technology from the Americans, of course. And initially, the Soviets didn't have the technology. But through the activities of spy rings and so on, at Portland and in America, they began to acquire the technology. And we had an interest in finding out quite what they were up to. How good were their towed array sonars? And so, actually, it was HMS Conqueror again, oddly enough, was equipped to try and capture one of the Soviet towed array sonars. And this was after the Falklands War, and there were a couple of abortive attempts to do it. Basically, on the bow of the Conqueror, there were massive pinchers which could grab the towed array, the cable, the hawser of the towed array sonar, and sever it, and a clamp or clamps that could then grip it so that it was retained by the submarine, in this case, Conqueror. And after the Falklands War, very soon after, actually, Conqueror had only been back in the UK for just over a month before she was back in the Barents Sea, because word had come through that there was a towed array sonar being trialled up there. And she went up, and this time it was successful. She managed to approach the towing vessel and sever it without being detected. It was severed in a way that looked as if it might have jagged on something on the seabed or something like that, rather than a clean break. So the Soviets may not even have known that it was captured by NATO. And it was brought back to the UK and promptly put on a plane at Prestwick, sent over to the States to be examined by American scientists. So that development of towed array sonar, a major development at the time when Swiftsure did that underwater look on the Kiev. Swiftsure had towed array sonar, which was brand new then. Kiev didn't, and so she wasn't very good at detecting. Array sonar could also be used to cut through different layers of what's called the thermocline, different layers of temperature and salinity in the water, seawater, which affected the propagation of sonar. So it could make it quite difficult for hull-mounted sonars in a submarine to detect through some things through different layers. Whereas towed array sonar, because it had so many hydrophones, could actually dip through a range of depths and pick up things that previous sonars just hadn't been able to find.
And the Americans are also tapping communications cables. Did you find any evidence of the Royal Navy participating in that?
No. I think we'd probably know about it. Obviously, if it happened, it would be highly classified. The Americans did do it. They even modified or built, I can't remember, a submarine that was specially equipped to do this. And they managed to do it both in the Barents Sea and also in the off Vladivostok, in that area, which were the two big areas of big Soviet submarine bases. So, yeah, the Yanks certainly did it. And there are accounts of it in, for example, a book called Blind Man's Buff. But it's never been reported that this was done by the Brits.
Hi, it's Ian again with an update. after I finished this interview, I remembered that I'd done an episode with David Arnold, who was an officer on HMS Valiant, a nuclear-powered Royal Navy submarine, and have a listen to his tale.
Then the other trip was up north. Now, how much should we say about up north? What's secret that happened 55 years ago? I don't know.
I presume you were somewhere around Murmansk or somewhere like that up north.
Yes, somewhere like that. Let's just hypothesize. Let's pretend you've got Archangel up the White Sea. You've got Murmansk, which is on the tip as you go round. Got the Barents Sea, and across from those places, those two, which are connected by telegraph cables on the seabed, there is a place called Novaya Zemlya, which is a long island shaped like a banana. And in the middle of it is a town, which I can't remember, where there is a gulag where they make nuclear depth charges, the NATO name of which I think was Lucy or something. It's always a matter of some debate that if they dropped a nuclear depth charge, it was meant to vaporize everything within a mile. And we didn't think this was very sociable, really, but nobody ever dropped a nuclear depth charge, as far as I know, not on us anyway. Anyway, the Barents Sea isn't very deep, and it is pretty flat. And you can bottom a submarine on it this is a hypothesis. If you bottom a submarine, and if you have a couple of swimmers, you can put them in a two-man tower, and you can shut one end and flood it up, and then you can open the other end, and out they go. And let's assume they have a little gadget with spikes on it and a lashing with a tape recorder that lasts about 6 months. So they swim away and find a spot where there's such a gadget been there for 6 months. They take it off, they put a new one on and come back, and away you go. On the thing is all the traffic on the from Murmansk to Novaya Zemlya to Archangel up in the White Sea. There's several of these cables, but then they had several of these little gadgets. And you do that every 6 months. And the Americans, they did the same thing off Vladivostok and the cycling islands and round the top corner of Russia that abuts America, Alaska, that way. So the Americans did that bit, and the Brits did our bit. Well, they did. I'm not saying they did it, but they could have done. And so that was an interesting navigational exercise.
If you'd like to hear more of David Arnold's account, it's episode 388, entitled From Merchant Navy to Covert Hunter-Killer Nuclear Submarine Missions. I'll leave a link in the episode information. You've done well to get these stories, I must say, Paul, from what you've got here. Now, one area of the Royal Navy Submarine Service we haven't really covered that much so far is the ballistic missile submarines. So in the 1960s, the UK decided that their nuclear deterrent will be moved from being air-launched by the Royal Air Force to being submarine-based, and the Polaris system is commissioned.
Yeah. That's right. Macmillan had managed to get the Yanks to agree to us having Polaris missiles, and we promptly set about building quite quickly the Resolution-class submarines in the mid-60s. So the Resolution went to sea in 1967, and there were a lot of trials and so on. By 1969, the Resolution-class boats had taken over the independent nuclear deterrent from the RAF. So there were 4 Resolution-class submarines equipped with Polaris, which had a range of something like 2,500 miles. And they carried 16 missiles aft of the conning tower. They were basically an elongated version of the Valiant class, but elongated to allow for the large missile compartment that they had. Now, they were based at Faslane, and the idea was that ideally two, but certainly always one, would be on patrol at any one time. And now, the only two people who would know on board the boat where they were patrolling was the commanding officer and his executive officer, possibly the navigating officer as well. So to this day, we don't know where they patrolled, but we know what the targets were. You might guess they were up in the Norwegian Sea or somewhere like that. And each boat had to remain undetected. And it's said that no British ballistic missile submarine was ever detected whilst it was on patrol. There were Soviet boats trying to detect them when they left Faslane and so on. But then there were various ruses to deploy, for example, a decoy attack submarine to lead a Soviet boat that was going to trail the ballistic submarine in the wrong direction. And each of those patrols last 7 or 8 weeks. That was the routine when they were first introduced. So we're talking about 50 to 60 days, something like that. Interesting to note that the most recent Trident submarine patrols have lasted up to, in one case, 200 days. It's really stretching the endurance of the crew. But in those days, it was 7 or 8 weeks. In the early days, the boats were presumably all in good maintenance order and so on. And possibly for as much as 70% of the time, there would actually be 2 boats on patrol. That wasn't achieved 100% of the time. Gradually, that degraded a bit over time as the boats needed more and more maintenance and long refits and stuff like that. That was the first generation of ballistic missile submarines, and they lasted until the early 90s when the Vanguard-class Trident submarines were introduced again, 4 of them, and the Trident missiles had a much longer range. Now, of course, the Soviets weren't going to miss out on all this, and they had large numbers of ballistic missile submarines. For example, in the mid-80s, there were something like 37 ballistic missile submarines in their northern fleet based at Murmansk. And then they had a whole load based at Vladivostok. So they had very large numbers of them. And one of the biggest missions of British nuclear SSNs, the attack submarines, was to locate the Soviet ballistic missile submarines and, if possible, trail them to their patrol areas. So we would always know where they were, which they never did with ours or the American boats. At that time, if we take, for example, the Northern Fleet, they had to pass through the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. So they either went through the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland or further east through the Iceland, Faroes, UK, Shetlands gap, which meant they weren't too difficult to detect because we could have maritime patrol aircraft like Nimrods. We had SSNs, the attack submarines patrolling. And we had the American social system of undersea sonar arrays on the seabed. And all of those things would probably detect. We knew their sound signatures. So when one of them crept out from Murmansk and came through the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, it was probably detected and it may well have been trailed to its patrol area. So we knew in those days, for example, they were patrolling off the east coast of America because of the comparatively shorter range of their missiles. Now, that changed in the late 70s, early 80s, because by then the range of these ballistic missiles was much greater. So the Soviets by then had ballistic missiles with an 8,000-mile range. And that meant they didn't have to sit off the coast of America and go through the Greenland Gap to get there. They could get up into the high latitudes of the Arctic Ocean. And this introduced a whole new dimension to the war theatre and submarine warfare. Because what the Soviets, and don't forget the Americans, could also do was to send a submarine up to the high latitudes, including very often under the ice pack. And the ballistic missile submarine could sit there, very difficult to detect, because under the ice pack, if the boat just sat there very silently, with perhaps its sail fin just touching the underside of the ice, then any attack submarine approaching it would be by far the loudest thing around. Alternatively, it could sit in the marginal ice zone, which was the fringe area of the ice pack, where there was a lot of broken ice and so on. And that was incredibly noisy because all the ice was bashing, all the pieces of ice were bashing against one another. And it was, again, very difficult to detect. And in fact, the Americans throughout the Cold War never perfected a way of detecting a submarine in the marginal ice zone. So that was a jolly good place for a Russian submarine to hide. And if it was right under the ice pack, it could surface in Apollina, which is a small lake somewhere in the ice, and launch its missiles from the Arctic Ocean, any target in Europe or the United States. And it was in a huge sea area of goodness knows how many million sea miles, and therefore very difficult to find. So all of that meant there was a whole new technology, if you like, of how you operate these submarines under the ice in a very different and more challenging environment than they'd been used to in the past. And the Yanks started investigating this very presciently in the late 40s with conventional submarines, but it was soon realized that nuclear submarines, when they came along, were going to be much, much better at this because they had much greater endurance under the ice and didn't need to surface if they didn't want to. So by 1959, the Americans were getting quite proficient at under ice operations, and they began to see this as in the nuclear submarine era as being vital if they were to have any chance of intercepting Soviet submarines that were taking refuge or passage under the ice cap. 3 or 4 years later, the first Russian submarine surfaced at the North Pole, and the Russians continued to develop their under ice technology and science. It wasn't until 1971 that HMS Dreadnought became the first British submarine to surface at the North Pole. With the Americans each year had at least one major under ice exercise, and invariably from about 1976 onwards, mid-70s onwards, right through the 80s as well, at least one of our submarines was involved in those exercises. They're acting as a target Soviet, in inverted commas, submarine, which the others were trying to get fire control solutions on, find and attack. So those exercises went on right throughout the remainder of the Cold War and afterwards as well.
Is there evidence that the Soviets were capturing acoustic signatures of our boats?
Yes, they did try to trail our boats, but we could turn the tables on them and trail them. But the Soviets built some particularly fast submarines that were much faster than any of our submarines, like the Alpha class, for example, which could make about 35 knots, had a titanium hull, and could do about 35 knots submerged. And they were quite adept at, if we had a submarine in the Barents Sea, actually tracking it down and trailing it. And if we tried to turn the tables and get to the other side of it, the Alpha, and then one or two other classes had this capability, was able to outstrip us and get back into a trailing position again. So yes, they did. And if nothing else, they knew for most of the Cold War how much quieter our submarines were than theirs. And it wasn't really till the last years of the Cold War that the Russians were apparently producing submarines that were anything like as quiet as the British and American ones.
Yeah, I think they had a spy in the US Navy who revealed that their submarines were noisier. And They got a Japanese metal cutting system to improve the quality of their propellers or something like that.
Okay.
Anyway, it was something. I think it was
a lot of the noise. You might
recall.
think it's the machinery, but a lot of the noise comes from the propellers. So that sounds quite feasible.
An update from Ian. It was the Walker spy ring who informed the Soviets that the US Navy could track their submarines using the SOSUS underwater hydrophone network, which detected the unique noise, otherwise known as cavitation, produced by Soviet propellers. In the 1980s, the Soviets illegally acquired advanced multi-axis computer-controlled milling machines from Japan's Toshiba Machine Company and Norway's Kongsberg Våpenfabrik. These machines allowed the Soviet Union to produce high-precision, skewed blade propellers, which are much quieter than the older designs. Previously, NATO could detect Soviet submarines from 200 miles away. After the improvements to the propellers, that detection distance decreased to roughly 10 miles. Certain Soviet submarines, such as the Akula class, were sometimes referred to in naval circles as Walker submarines because their enhanced silence was directly attributed to the intelligence and technology acquired during the time of the Walker spy ring. So, presumably the Soviets, they're coming in close to our bases as well, so they're sniffing around Holy Lock and Faz Lake.
They were. There was one incident where an American boat, I can't remember, it was a ballistic missile boat, out of Holy Lock collided with a snooping Russian SSN, out in the Clyde approaches. So they certainly were. They were around there, and they had intelligence trawlers. They had one permanently virtually stationed off of Malin Head, monitoring whatever was going on in that area. But the Clyde approaches were a regular covert patrol area for their submarines. So they could detect very often our ballistic submarines at very early stage in their patrols, but not successfully trail them because they were so quiet.
I can't remember who I interviewed. It could have been Rob Forsyth, where he mentioned that what they tended to do was to wait until there was a football match on, because the Malin Head AGI would then move closer to the Irish coast to get good TV reception.
Okay, well, that makes sense. It must have been rather boring sitting there all that time with probably nothing much happening most of the time. And similarly, one of our exercise areas was in those years was Portland, because that was our main anti-submarine base where all the anti-submarine training was done. And so again, it was a hunting ground for the Soviets to have intelligence trawlers or even a snooping submarine off Portland.
Were there any accidents or incidents with any of our ballistic missile submarines during the Cold War?
There were no incidents of a sort of collision type. There were one or two close calls where some sort of defect occurred in the submarine, and it was touch and go whether the submarine was going to have to return to base and abort its patrol. We're told that never happened, and that to this day, there's never been a time when one of our SSBNs has not been on patrol over that huge period of time from 1969 till 2026. No.
Hi, it's Ian again with an update. Just want to point you in the direction of another episode. I'm going to give you a short excerpt now. It's with Commodore Eric Thompson, and he served on Polaris boats, and he describes a dangerous situation with a nuclear reactor.
But this was quite a big leak, and we knew that because of the amount of water to keep pumping out of the reactor compartment bilge. Now, the reactor compartment's unmanned because of the radioactivity in it. So I felt we had to do something about this. We're on, I think, the first week of our patrol, and we had another 9 weeks to go. So that involved very complicated nuclear procedures. We basically had to shut the reactor down at sea on patrol. Now, a nuclear-powered submarine, it's not like a diesel submarine. You don't have huge batteries to keep it going for lengthy periods. Our battery was really just enough to allow us to shut down the reactor and start up again, which is probably about an hour in total. 20 minutes to shut down, let the radiation levels drop. You've got about 20 minutes to go into the reactor compartment, and then you've got to come out, and it takes 20 minutes to get the reactor started up again. So you've got to do quite a lot of things in that hour.
If you'd like to hear more from Eric, his episode is episode 162. It's entitled On Her Majesty's Nuclear Submarine Service. There'll be a link in the episode information.
There was one incident later, wasn't there, when I think it was Vanguard, so after the Cold War, actually collided with a French ballistic missile submarine because the French weren't sharing information, whereas we shared with the Yanks information of where our boats were. The French at that time weren't doing that. So there was a collision between one of the French ballistic submarines, and I don't think it was major damage caused, but it was publicised at the time. But that was after the end of sometime, I think probably in the late 90s.
But there was some problems with cracking in the whole of the nuclear submarine fleet.
Yeah. Yes, one of the problems was cracking, what was trouser legs cracking of the stainless steel pipes in the primary coolant circuit of the nuclear reactor. Now that really became evident in the 80s and started to affect the reliability and the availability of the submarines. And particularly the Valiant and the Swiftsure class submarines were suffering from this, and they were spending quite a lot of time out of action. To some extent, the Resolution class did as well, so that started to contribute to this sort of degradation. And this was something that was experienced by the Americans as well, we are told. And so there were increasingly large amounts of time spent on boats having to stay alongside, having these pipes repaired. And it even became the reason why, as the end of the Cold War came, why several boats were paid off, because they were going to need extensive repairs because of trouser leg cracks. And one of the attack submarines was on patrol in the South Atlantic after the Falklands War had ended, because they were still being sent down there to monitor whatever Argentine activity there might be, which was very little. And one of them suffered this problem, and it had to abort its patrol in the South Atlantic and return home slowly. So that kind of incident certainly did occur, but it never caused a ballistic missile submarine patrol to be aborted, as far as we know.
I think one of my favourite stories, and I've probably got a lot of favourite stories in this book, is where you describe the visit of HMS Opportune to Severomorsk in 1993, where the CO is quizzed about how effective the British submarine forces have been against them.
Yeah, that was quite a landmark occasion. And during Opportune's last month of service, she made a historic visit to Severomorsk, which was one of the main submarine bases at Murmansk. And she came there. She was, by this time, of course, an old submarine. This was 1993, by which time she was not quite 30 years old, but not far off. And she was escorted into the base by a very modern Russian submarine of the Kilo class, a 3-year-old. And a military band stood on the pier playing the Northern Fleet's wartime anthem, Farewell the Craggy Hills. I assume that's a translation. And she was the first Western submarine to visit that submarine base, although many others had spied on the base and its environs in the past 40 years. And whilst exchanging drinks and stories, Russian officers quizzed their guests to find out how far they might have come undetected in the past, how close. Well, the Opportune's captain replied, I'm afraid I can't discuss operations that I've done in the past. And this was his rather stiff reply, because it was the admiral commanding the Northern Fleet who had asked the question. So his lips were sealed, just as they've probably remained ever since. And that's why it's so difficult getting these stories about what the boats actually did.
The book is called Secret Warriors, British Submarines During the Cold War. You've been listening to Dr. Paul Brown. There will be links in the episode notes for you to buy the book. It's a glorious coffee table book with excellent photos and fascinating content, as you've just heard from Paul. It definitely comes Cold War Conversations recommended, so it doesn't get better than that. If you'd like more Cold War submarine stories, tales of daring do beneath the sea, then do check out the episode information where there'll be a list of the relevant episodes on the podcast. The episode extras such as videos, photos and other content are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.